So to say that international law is being used in a way that doesn't help or doesn't go into the direction of social justice, I agree with that. And this is what we are trying to stop a little bit. But how? How? Without this executive power. And I would say that international law is the weak party here against the hegemons. And the weak party cannot have classical strategy of confrontation with the enemy. If it does that, it will be swiped in the first battle. It has to use the techniques of guerrilla warfare. And what is the techniques of guerrilla warfare in international? It is increasing the cost of violation to the one who violates, neutralizing the legal effects of what we cannot change on the ground, at least neutralizing the legal effects, increasing the nuisance value of the violation.
Welcome to the Opinion Jurist podcast. Today we have the honor of speaking with Professor Georges Abi-Saab, a towering figure in the realm of international law, whose work has inspired generations of legal scholars, and specifically third world legal scholars. Now, if you're a student or scholar of international law, especially from the Global South, chances are you've not only come across Professor Abi-Saab's work, but his writings were your first foray into imagining a truly emancipatory international law. For over 6 decades now, he's been a guiding light for those of us trying to make sense of international law from a third world perspective. His intellectual journey, which began in the early 1960s, has been marked by this commitment to explore the challenges faced by newly independent states, but also making sense of the role of the intellectual. Throughout his career, Professor Abi-Saab has embodied what he calls the organic intellectual, he who not only theorizes, but also works tirelessly to transform his ideas into practice. As he explained to us in this conversation, this approach provides a compass for critical scholarship that can be applied to all facets of international law and serves as a lodestar for young scholars venturing into critique. What sets Abi-Saab apart is in fact this blueprint for critique, which he conceives from the inside of the system. He argues that participation in the decision-making process does not necessarily mean collaboration or co-optation, but rather a way to ensure that interests and decisions do not veer the system in the wrong direction. This strategy, which he terms confrontation, participation, and operation behind enemy lines, offers an approach to engaging with and transforming international law from within. In today's episode, we will delve into Professor Abi-Saab's reflection on his remarkable career and the evolution of international law. We'll explore his thoughts on how critique has improved the field and the practice of international law, and discuss the changes he's observed in the nature of the critique over time. Given the global events at the time of recording, we'll also seek Professor Abi-Saab's insights on the pressing issues such as the ICJ's role in the Palestinian question and how these developments have impacted his perspective on international law. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Abi-Saab.
So, Professor Abi-Saab, it's an honor to have you today here with us for this podcast. I would like to ask you a few questions that are going to span a little bit, then you might say, the entirety of your engagement with international law, the entirety of your career. And so the first question that we had for you was, when you're reflecting on international law, having engaged with it for the entirety of your life, what are some of the more notable developments that stand out in your memory?
Well, the most striking aspect, which I think young people like you cannot think of, is the explosion of the field of international law. It has become so large, you cannot imagine. I mean, in 1955, I was following a graduate course at the University of Cairo in international law by a famous professor, Italian professor, Professor Ronaldo Quadri was giving an advanced course in the Diplôme de droit public, Diplôme supérieur de droit public. And he was so happy with the Corfu Channel case. And why? Because he said all the cases we have were cases of diplomatic protection, meaning cases brought by an individual through his state. And this is the first case where the International Court speaks of a case. Of course, there are other cases, but I mean important case between state-to-state responsibility. Can you imagine that? If you consider all the cases we have about state responsibility now, the fields are covered by international law. Some fields never existed. I mean, everybody was considered that the great innovation in the 50s, up to the 50s, was a continental shelf, which is the extension, the Truman Declaration of 45 that extended the hold of the state over the subsoil up to 200 meters depth, and 200 meters was considered unattainable then. Now we go up to 5,000, 7,000 even in certain cases. So whole fields, law of space, law of environment, and so forth, all these ratione materiae, international law has expanded in a way that could not have been imagined in the 50s. And so, but I have to say that the expansion of international law here is the expansion of material law. It was not accompanied, or not to the same extent, in fact, to a much lesser extent, by the development of structures and mechanisms of application and follow-up. And in fact, this gap is one of the great problems which remain with us. We can speak of that later on. So that's perhaps the other important thing, which is very dear to my heart, is the emergence of the international community as a constitutive part of international law, and as a pivot, I would say. You know, classical international law is a synalagmatic law of exchange of considerations based on reciprocity. And there is no third party between the people who exchange considerations. And suddenly, we have slowly the emergence of public interest above the interest of the parties. I mean, can you imagine, for example, that in the early 50s, a book of international law, which was considered as one of the major new books, the Traité de droit international of Professor Paul Guggenheim. In that book, in the French edition, because it was first in German and then was translated into French, brought up to date in the early 50s, it is mentioned that states can transact on any subject. There are no limits to what states can agree upon. The idea of jus cogens didn't even flare in the minds And it started to come when the International Law Commission started to codify the law of treaties. And then they could not avoid the question of jus cogens. Although it has not been the articles in the Vienna Convention which refer to jus cogens have not been very much used. I mean, no state took the courage of bringing a case on the basis of the Vienna Convention to the International Court, considering that certain rules are jus cogens, but it is there. So the idea of this public interest, and in fact, that is the theme of all my writings, etc. I was inspired by a great master in this, who is Professor Friedman. His idea that we are moving from the law of coexistence, which is classical international law, which is the synalagmatic law I spoke of, which is a law between potentially antagonistic units, and it tries to pacify them not by imposing positive duties on them, but by imposing passive obligations, not to do, not obligations to do, to a law of cooperation. And cooperation means what? That you have to do something. And if you have different people, different subjects of law, of different capacities, of different resources, they cannot all do the same thing. You have to have a kind of division of labor, you have to have a kind of a guide. And here, the whole idea is that you are serving what? A collective interest. It can be a collective interest emerging, for example, the environment, which we didn't think of at that time, or it can be a collective value also, human rights. We forget that human rights were introduced on the international level by the Charter only in 1945. It existed as constitutional doctrine in internal law, but not on the international level. I mean, all these things cannot exist except in attribution and relation to the idea of a higher value and an international community around which these values emerge and which becomes the guardian of them in a way. So I'm sorry I went a little bit further, but these are, in my view, the very striking aspects which I was happy to notice and to practice, or I mean, to contribute to, in a very, very modest way, to explain, to try to show how all this meshes together.
Well, thank you for that answer. Really interesting to think of it through the lens of the international community, because those of us today who are teaching international law speak of the international community in this way as if it's almost always existed. And so contextualizing it in that way temporally, and going back then to your own days then as a law student is really helpful in terms of our reflections around the direction that international law has gone in, particularly that element there in terms of these negative obligations versus positive duties. And in fact, Omar wants to probe a little bit in terms of your own contribution to this debate.
Definitely, and I did think actually this sort of retranscription of the developments of international law was extremely helpful for that. So you spoke to us about sort of these explosion of international law's popularity. Can you tell us more about specific aspects in your own career that you reflect on today, whether it be, as a scholar of the Global South, or as a practitioner of this field that is rapidly expanding?
Well, it's very difficult to go into a kind of a list. But I would say that many of these considerations were, I sensed them, but I didn't articulate them. It was in my head, and they came out slowly. So in my writings first, my first published, I can't say it's an article because it was only 10 pages, was published in the Proceedings of the American Society of International Law in 1960. I was still a graduate student at Harvard at that time. And it was about, the title was The Newly Independent States and the Scope of Domestic Jurisdiction. In fact, I have to say something personal, which can explain a little bit the tendencies. I discovered international law at the law school, of course, but also I discovered what was then called political economy. Not the political economy in the sense now, economics with politics, but that was in French the title of economics. And I hesitated between specializing in one or the other. But in both cases, my interest was perhaps the inclination of how to help and protect the weak members of society, a kind of idea of social justice. And whether it's easier to do it by my specializing in economics, because economics, or as the song goes, money makes the world go round, or to do international law because, and here comes the idea of third world, because among the weak who need to be helped are the weak countries, the colonial territories, the ex-colonies, and so forth. And in fact, these are really, even when they are given independence, like Egypt, my own country, it is with great strings attached to keep the unequal relations, so a kind of reduction of the principle of equality of states by agreement. These are, of course, themes which are very well known, developed already since the end of the 19th century, of unequal treaties and so forth. So I got into the field with this idea of how to protect the newly independent states. And that's why my first small article has this idea of newly independent states and scope of domestic jurisdiction. Now, all I did after that was a little bit conditioned by this mental disposition. And in a way, in 1962, I was asked to participate in a conference at Howard University, which was prepared by one of my colleagues at Harvard Law School when I was there. I left in 1960, Newton Pact. And I chose as a theme I think the article was entitled the newly independent states and the rules of international law, a preliminary survey. And in a way, I never thought of it as a project, but amazingly enough, there is an article by a professor of Yale, which was published 2-3 years ago in the Journal of History of International Law, where he starts with a reference to this article, and he calls it my project. I didn't intend it to be a project, but indeed it is. It could be looked at that. And I took simply, if you want, the table of contents of a book of international law, subject by subject, and said how what we call now global south, or before third world or newly independent states, well, what counts is the fringe, those who are excluded in a way from the real power of decision, feel and would like to see international law develop by subject. The sources, the different sources, the responsibility, the use of force, and so forth. And in a way, that's what I did in the rest of my career. I did many things, even when I dealt with very technical questions. For example, my first book published in French in 1967 was on the preliminary objections in the procedure of the court. Even there, the idea is how to make these instruments, very complicated instruments, available to make them understandable and available to third world countries. So I would say that in everything I did, whether in international humanitarian law, which I worked a lot, particularly about wars of national liberation, but also about other things, I put much emphasis also on improving the monitoring and follow-up. But unfortunately, we haven't advanced much on that. Or in international economic law, or on technical subjects, or on spatial delimitations. These are the different subjects I happen to deal with. I have always kept in mind how to defend the weak vis-a-vis the strong, and to give some semblance of equality. What is needed to give the law that governs the relationship some semblance of equality of opportunity and equality between the parties. I don't know if that answers a little bit what you said. So in a way, I have une boussole. How do you translate that in English?
It would be a compass, Professor. A compass, Professor.
Compass, yes. There was a compass, and it worked whatever the subject I was dealing with. But the compass was always the same. So that's perhaps my short or long answer to your second question.
If I can say, so it's really delightful to hear that answer, in large part because you were an inspiration to many colleagues who tend to approach international law from a third world perspective, from a critical perspective. And so hearing you speak then about that tension then that you faced between studying international law or political economy, and many of us have faced that same dilemma. And so we're delighted, and some of us went, I know myself that is the case, who was studying political economy at the time. I ended up going in the direction of international law after reading some of your works. And so with that, that brings us to the next question, because you were speaking then about the direction that it has gone in and the things that you've observed. And I wonder, because you did say that you had some of those ideas, has international law evolved the way you anticipated?
In a way, yes, but not completely and not on every subject. Let's say there are certain things which were common and which nobody can claim now. I mean, even the Charter of the United Nations recognized colonialism. Well, of course, try to give the means of reducing it, liquidating it, but it was not a total prohibition, let's say. Now I think colonialism in the direct control of one people, of another people, another territory is completely out, particularly with the prohibition of the use of force and prohibition of acquisition of territory by force. Although we see that there is such a thing which is going on in Palestine right now, but nobody, even if they do nothing about it, but nobody approves it. I mean, annexation is completely proscribed. So that's one. The concept of universality also, which necessarily calls for equality of the parties before the law, and of course, material equality is another question. But at least formally, these principles now are so well entrenched that nobody can dare, I would say. Of course, memory is not, human memory is not always very clear. I mean, people forget that up to the end of the 19th century, slavery formally existed in certain parts, etc. And then that now, of course, this is considered a great crime and so forth. There are other forms of slavery now, but they are not slavery in this technically the general sense we speak of. So certain things, I would say, hypocrisy remains by using the principles but not following them. But nobody dares to contest the principles. And that is very important all the same. So, you know the famous French saying that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. So we have a lot of it, of course, in the field of international law, but at least the open challenges of these basic principles it has gone. So now what to do with the rest? How can really to bring this great expansion of substantive law to cull with the practice and so forth? Here we run into the problem of executive power. As long as the executive power remains in the hand of states, and in the hands of states, meaning all states, but in reality, if it is in the hands of states, it ends up in the hands of the strong states. And the only way is to really get parcels of executive power here and there through creating a community-run institution and giving them that parcels of executive power. So that at least we can neutralize the inequality in certain areas. But when it comes to war and peace, of course, what we see actually now of the use of force shows the great schism and the great hiatus in that respect.
Professor, I wanted to go back to this compass you spoke to us about, because it is quite a helpful image for us younger scholars who don't exactly know how to navigate critique and the different shapes it takes as the field evolves with time. And so I want to ask you, have you observed any changes in the nature of the critique of international law?
Yes, yes. In fact, I mean, some of the writers put me as first generation third world approaches to international law. And in a conference which took place in Cairo, in fact, in 2005, it was about the role of the intellectuals of the third world in international law. And the proceedings were published in Third World Quarterly. And I have an article there. And I say that, yes, I consider myself one of the early Third World scholars who try to re-examine critically international law from that perspective. But I didn't consider myself as, what is it called, Third World?
Third world approaches to international law, the TWAIL?
TWAIL, yes.
TWAIL.
Consider myself as a TWAILer, because the term TWAIL came later on by a group which was around David Kennedy at Harvard, And I don't partake in their way of critique, because they are rejectionists in a way. They consider that everything is wrong. We have to throw it away, and what? They don't propose any positive alternative. And that, to me, is the worst type of criticism. Well, some of them have wisened. I mean, I like very much Tony Angie, who is a good friend, younger friend, but good friend, but and so forth. And I don't want also to put everything on colonialism. I mean, it's not a one efficient cause of all our problems. It's a major cause, but not the only one. My idea is constructive criticism. And this is why I am not of that type of criticism, which unfortunately I find that it is more and more expanded. And I think that if you criticize something, you have to tell us how we can change it by something better, can do the same function. But destroying the law with no proposal for a substitute is really, we return to a situation where no law exists, but there is a law which exists, which is the law of the jungle. The big fish can eat the small fish with good conscience, because that's how nature is. It's social Darwinism, you know. And I don't think this is the best way. I also hate the populist slogans like decolonizing international law. What does this mean, decolonizing international? But I accept it in a way, because if we mean by decolonizing natural law, international law, but I don't like the way it is used, means that you try to revise it by cleansing it from all these remnants of colonialism and inequalities. Okay, yes, but why don't we say simply re-examination, etc.? Because you see, we have to convince not the convinced, because they are already behind us or with us. We have to convince the others, and we have to show them that sticking to classical international law with all its shortcomings is in the end not in the interest, in their own interests. And to bring about more clearly the idea of the common interest, of the community interest, and so forth. So that's my own approach to, and I think that slowly, even those who are a little bit excité, agitated, will end up understanding that this is the better way. So that's my answer to that question.
Thank you for that answer, Professor. It's fascinating, and I imagine even some of the listeners will be fascinated because I tend to write more from that critical perspective, potentially even some of those elements there that you were critiquing in your response. And without trying to defend it, it's more along the lines of maybe empathizing with those who are questioning whether or not international law really does arch towards social justice.
Yes.
And of course, we have to ask that question because of what's taking place in Palestine.
Yeah.
And so we have no choice but to ask you, when you see what is taking place in Palestine, when we see the genocide then that is being carried out against them, we wonder, have the events of the past year, including the events on the ground, but also the events before the ICJ, have these reinforced or have they challenged your seeming faith in international law?
Okay. Well, you see, let me answer the general proposition and then I'll come to Palestine. The general proposition is, what is the total effect of international law? Whose interest it serves, etc. One thing is very important. We are speaking of international law here as an actor, but it's not an actor. International law is a legal system with no executive power or state behind it that can execute its prescriptions or can guarantee the respect of its prescriptions. It is a set of norms and mechanisms and techniques and processes which can be used one way or another. The question is how it is used and by whom. And here I come back to this idea of a legal system without an executive behind it to guarantee. In Italian, they speak not of they speak of the guarantee of law, which is exactly what I call executive power. So to say that international law is being used in a way that doesn't help or doesn't go into the direction of social justice, I agree with that. But, and this is what we are trying to stop a little bit. But how? How? Without this executive power. And this brings me back to my work on wars of national liberation, which took a good 10 years of my life. And I would say that international law is the weak party here against the hegemons. Is a weak party. And the weak party cannot have classical strategy of confrontation with the enemy. If it does that, it will be swiped in the first battle. It has to use the techniques of guerrilla warfare. And what is the techniques of guerrilla warfare in international? It is increasing the cost of violation to the one who violates, neutralizing the legal effects of what we cannot change on the ground, at least neutralizing the legal effects, increasing the nuisance value of the violations. How? Of course, these are weak elements by the principle of non-recognition of legal situation, by the stopping the work, what in classical international law they considered as the remedy of time. It's the passing of time itself ends to be considered as acquiescence, as implied acceptance of the illegal situation, and so forth. All these doctrines should be neutralized and are neutralized to a great extent in the different instruments which have been developed in codification and other words. By the emergence, by the flagrant, not flagrant, but impressive emergence of international criminal justice. And of course, when you have a warrant, an arrest warrant against a head of state in exercise, you cannot get your hand on it. But it bothers him because he cannot travel, or before traveling, he has to ask the states where he's going to make a declaration, etc. Anyway, it becomes a problem. It's small things, but together, at least they try to freeze the status juris of the illegal situation. Now, to reverse it is a different proposition. Without real executive power, I mean, look at what's happening in Palestine or now in southern Lebanon. I mean, Israel is not a superpower. It is protected by a superpower, okay. But it's a small country with a strong, they developed a strong and effective army. And they are attacking or neutralizing all the surrounding countries, including those who have signed peace treaties with them. I mean, this is a kind of neutralization, all the same. And nobody, the whole international community seems to be paralyzed simply because the Americans protect them. But what is very important is not to accept the fait accompli as status juris, and to insist and to proscribe as much as possible. I mean, Israel has lost a lot in terms of international sympathy, even among its closest allies. Look at the youth in America, including Jewish youth, and not to speak of elsewhere in the world, and so forth. So, I mean, in the end, something has to give. I mean, the optimistic example is, well, of course, it was much less rabid as what we are speaking about, but is the collapse of apartheid in South Africa. Nobody thought it would come to that. But of course, it all also passes through the minds of people, and de Klerk was a wise man in the end to realize that it cannot endure. So he chose as actually perhaps, I'm not sure even that Rabin and Perez had the same conviction, but at least they made an expression of goodwill which could have led to something if it was not stopped by the assassination of Rabin. What can happen in the future? You tell me. Nobody can really foretell the future, but I mean, in the final analysis, if there are strong criticisms followed by even symbolic acts, etc., a persistent violator, however strong he is, will have to make his cost-benefit analysis and see whether persisting is paying in the long run or not. That's all I can say. Now, if I think about that, I think you said ICJ and ICC. I think the development there in both of them is very important. It's a good thing because, well, the ICJ, you know, I have been an ICJ watcher for a long time. I wrote a lot about it and so forth. It vacillates between, according to the composition of the court and the case, circumstances of the case, between two positions. One position is speaking as the oracle of the international community. And this is clear in cases where the court itself realized that it's not in the immediate interest of the court, but it had to do it, like in the Nicaragua case, like in the Wall case, which I had the honor to be the lead counsel for the Palestinian Authority in that case. And recently in the advisory opinion about Palestine. In fact, in the Wall case, the court went even beyond what it was asked to do and spoke of the final solution and so forth. So the court was heartened, and the case of South Africa is very good also. And I salute South Africa to have taken this, and I wonder why other Arab countries have not joined, but that's another question. But in other cases, they were wishy-washy. I mean, like in the case of Kosovo, they avoided to speak about self-determination, found a way out. Yeah. I call that, in many cases, transactional justice, which is understandable when it comes to territorial delimitations. You have to, and that is a kind of also equity within the law. But but on major questions involving really the international community as a whole, the court has taken, in the few cases I mentioned, a very good position as a representative of world order and the international community. The ICC is a new organization. I had been a judge on the appeals chamber of the the Tribunal for ex-Yugoslavia and yes, the other one. But the emergence of these tribunals are part of the, as I said, the guerrilla warfare against illegality. And I mean, as far as the ICC, the prosecutor made his position clear, but it's the judges who have not given yet their accord to indict and hence to try to arrest the leaders on both sides. So it's still to be seen what will take place.
So, Professor, given sort of these uncertainties, and I'd like to end with this because we've taken so much of your time already. Given these uncertainties with these international institutions, with the ability for international law to provide justice, would you have any final words for young scholars who are just going into the world of international law and might be listening to this?
Well, I think the world is made by people. And one has to think that even a small effort in the good direction, I mean, who knows who will be judged, for example, in 30 years, in 40 years, in a case of that sort? Who will be the foreign minister of this or that state? I mean, we try to help young people to think in a certain way which we consider that it can lead to a peaceful world, more peaceful world. It's never 100%, more peaceful and more just in every way. And if, I mean, these people will become later the decision makers. So, and they can influence, and even us, we can influence to some extent when one finds himself in a position where he participates in the decision making as an arbitrator, as a judge, as a legal advisor of a foreign ministry, etc. So one should not abandon hope even in the face of such tragic situations as we are living these days.
Thank you very much for those concluding remarks, Professor Abi-Saab. This was a very insightful conversation, as in there were a lot of gems. You spoke about guerrilla warfare against illegality and increasing the cost of violation. I suspect a number of colleagues are going to want to research that further. You also spoke about transactional justice. Very interesting then to conceptualize it in that way. And perhaps what I appreciated most of all was their concluding remarks and the idea that the world is made by people. And I'm reminded of the time I've spent with your friend Tony Angie. And Tony would demonstrate that similar level of optimism. And I suspect then that you have certainly rubbed off on him in that way. And I feel that you've kind of rubbed off on me as well. My very first piece, you mentioned your very first piece, my very first piece was on legal education and international law, and I entitled it Twale Pedagogy. And it was probably my most optimistic piece, in large part because I was just coming into it. And then after a number of years and the struggles, I wouldn't say that we become a little bit cynical, we become a little bit more critical, and we start to look for ways then that we can challenge some of these structures of power that you referred to so that we can advance that cause of justice. And I think a great place to start would be, in one part, in your disposition, what you've shared with us today, and then in the other part in your scholarship, which has certainly provided a compass for many scholars around the world. So many thanks for your contributions to international law. Many thanks for taking the time to meet with us today. As two fellow Egyptian scholars of international law, we are, of course, as I said at the beginning, very honored to have this time with you, and we appreciate what you've done in advancing that cause of social justice within the context of international law and advancing the cause of third world countries like ours, Egypt, that may have had handcuffs placed on it in that post-colonial period, but are still trying to break free from that period and to take the world in another direction.
Thank you very much for your hospitality.
Thank you so much, Professor.